Britain has long been seriously infiltrated by Russia, and so NATO was compromised from the start. In addition to the well-known Cambridge 5 traitors and the nuclear spies, there were also suspicions against MI5 director Hollis and Lord Louis Mountbatten. I refer you to a video on this channel called The Biggest Mole Inside NATO. The infiltration problem also extends to old secret networks that Britain had set up in the United States. After the Revolutionary War, the British already had networks in the 13 colonies. And later, in the period of US expansion, the British sent new spies disguised as migrants and entrepreneurs. The close German relatives of the British nobility were also able to send additional spies. The Skull and Bones organization is enormously influential in politics, the military, and the secret services. It was involved in the preliminary phase of the Communist Revolution and then in technology sales to the Soviet Union. Bones was also instrumental in the war on Islamic terror that had turned the entire Muslim world against the West. The administration of George W. Bush, a Bones member, was particularly notable for its appeasement of the Putin regime. In addition to American technology, the Soviets also received loans in a series of business agreements with the W.A. Harriman Company and the Guarantee Trust, both of them full of Bones members. The law firm of Simpson, Thatcher and Bartlett was located at 120 Broadway in New York in the 1920s and helped the interests of the Soviet Union. The law firm was founded in 1884 by Thomas Thatcher, a Skull and Bones member. His son, Thomas Day Thatcher, also a Bones member, worked for the family law firm after leaving Yale and entering the order. The younger Thomas Thatcher worked for Henry L. Stimson, also a Bones member. The Anglo-Soviet Trade Agreement was an agreement signed on March 16, 1921 to facilitate trade between the United Kingdom and the Russian Soviet Republic. It was signed by Robert Horne, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Leonid Krasin, the Russian Commissioner for Foreign Trade. Robert Stevenson Horne, the first Viscount Horne of Slaminen, sat on the Privy Council and was also a King's Counsel. The center of Skull and Bones was the Yale University. So then, of course, we look at Elihu Yale. Elihu Yale was a British-American colonial administrator. His ancestors include the royal family of Plantagenet. Elihu's father was a wealthy Boston merchant and lawyer to Robert Ridge, the second Earl of Warwick, a member of the British Privy Council. Samuel Eaton, Elihu Yale's uncle, helped found Harvard. Elihu only lived in America as a child and spent the rest of his life in England, Wales, and India. He became an employee of the infamous East India Company. In 1699, he returned to Britain with a considerable fortune of around £200,000, most of which he earned through the sale of diamonds. Notable diamonds from these mines included the Orlov diamond, which belonged to Prince Grigory Orlov and Catherine the Great, the Black Orlov diamond, which belonged to Russian princesses, and the Hope diamond, which belonged to Louis XIV. London became the international trading center for diamonds. Elihu's neighbors included the Duke of Powys, Lord Chancellor Bathurst, Queen Anne, and her son, Prince William, the Duke of Gloucester. Elihu's son-in-law was Lord James Cavendish. James was a grandson of Countess Elizabeth Cecil of Hatfield House, a member of the extremely influential House of Cecil. Then we look at James Pierpont. James Pierpont is credited with founding Yale University in the United States. He married the daughter of John Davenport, co-founder of the American colony of New Haven. Davenport was educated at Oxford University. James Pierpont's daughter Sarah married the well-known colonial secretary Jonathan Edwards. Pierpont's descendants also include US Vice President Aaron Burr. Another descendant was financier John Pierpont J.P. Morgan, who was the driving force behind the wave of industrial consolidation in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Morgan first joined the firm of Peabody & Co. The house's creditors, including Baring Brothers of England, demanded payment. Peabody resisted and in November 1857 approached the Bank of England for a loan. The loan ensured the survival of the house and the London office was stabilized. In 1871, financier Anthony Joseph Drexel became JP's mentor. They founded Drexel, Morgan & Co. Drexel's brother Joseph William had a daughter named Elizabeth. She married John Beresford, the 5th Baron Decies from the British Privy Council for Ireland. Elizabeth, the Baroness Decies, claimed that Lord Louis Mountbatten was known to be a homosexual and had a perversion towards little boys. Her information ended up in the FBI's files on Mountbatten. Her book, Turn of the World, was a semi-autobiographical history of American high society from the so-called gay 90s to the First World War. Then we look at Alphonso Taft. Taft was an American lawyer, diplomat, politician, attorney general, and secretary of war. He was a descendant of several ancient New England families, including those of Huntington, Pierpont, Hooker, Willett, Bingham, and Russell. His ancestor, Noah Dyer Russell, was a founder and original trustee of Yale College. The descendant William Howard Taft IV worked in several Republican administrations, most recently that of George W. Bush. Next, we look at William Huntington Russell, an American businessman, educator, and politician. He founded Skull and Bones as the Russell Trust in 1856, along with several other bonesmen. The Russell Trust Association is a tax-exempt association. It owns the Skull and Bones Hall at Yale University and the Society's resort island called Deer Island. Next, we look at Yale in China. Since its inception, Skull and Bones annually selects 15 new members of the junior class to join the society. In the 2004 US presidential election, both the Democratic and Republican candidates were members of Skull and Bones. Skull and Bones recruited most of the important New England families who profited from the opium trade with China, including the Coffins, Sloans, Tafts, Bundys, Paynes, and Whitneys. The Bush family is one of the more publicly known but not particularly high-ranking from the old money families from the East Coast. George H.W. Bush, the first U.S. diplomatic envoy sent to the People's Republic of China in 1973, was a member of Skull and Bones, as were his father, brother, son, uncle, nephew, and several cousins. Winston Lord, the U.S. ambassador to China during the Reagan-Bush administration, was a member, as were his father and several relatives. Also the ambassador to China, James Lilly, and his brother. Aside from the Carter administration, every U.S. ambassador to China since Henry Kissinger's deal with Mao has been a member of Skull and Bones. Even before the communist takeover in China, Yale was represented there with the organization called Yale in China. Of course, Yale was far from the only organization in China that could be used for subversive intelligence operations. The infamous Mao was a nobody from a middle-class family, a student with limited financial resources, no education to speak of, and no contacts to speak of. The communists took notice of him because he seemed to have great success with a number of communist bookstores. He could brag about large book sales, and so the party considered him a kind of a marketing genius and a stirring propagandist who needed to be given higher tasks. But how did Mao manage to become a successful entrepreneur with several bookstores during his time as a poor student? First of all, he was lucky to be able to rent the right space at attractive conditions and to receive help from an unusual source in gaining experience in running an editorial publication. His lucky angel was Yale in China, a charitable medical institution that was based on the elite American university Yale and was used by the secret society Skull and Bones for espionage purposes. How close was Mao to this network? The book, The Yale-China Association, A Centennial History by Nancy E. Chapman and Jessica C. Plumb is very tight-lipped, mentioning only in passing that Mao may have used facilities that had housed Yale in China years earlier. The Yale Daily News of February 29, 1972 was much clearer, running a report entitled Yale Group Spurs Mao's Emergence. It says, without Yale's support, Mao Zedong may never have risen from anonymity to become the ruler of China. Jonathan Spence, a professor of Chinese history, was the first to discover Mao Zedong's connection to Yale. At this important juncture, the Yale in China Student Union had invited Mao to lead the editorial board of its journal. When Mao later founded a local cell of the Communist Party, Yale stepped in again and rented him 3 rooms, which he called a cultural bookstore, and from which he successfully sold works such as An Introduction to Marxist Capital and The Soviet System in China. The book sales are said to have gone so well that he was able to open 7 more stores and became extremely popular with the party. There is the possibility of secret subsidization by agents under the cover of the Yale organization. Agents could have provided money to middlemen who then bought excessive amounts of Mao's books. Perhaps a large part of the book sales existed only on paper, and Mao was able to impress the party with full coffers and fictitious sales figures to rise in the party. The Yale-China Association viewed Horace Tracy Pitkin, the Yale graduate and descendant of the university's founder, as something of a martyr because he was killed during the so-called Boxer Rebellion in China. In 1892, Horace went to New York's Union Theological Seminary, a center for American infiltration of Asia. Union Theological was dominated for 20 years by Henry Sloane Coffin, a leading U.S. intelligence official from the Sloane and Coffin families. He was a member of Skull and Bones, as were a dozen of his relatives. The medical work and research of Yale organizations in China is reminiscent of the Peking Union Medical College Hospital, which was started by American and British church organizations and received money from the Rockefeller Foundation. Yale expanded enormously in China because of the urgent need for Western medical research. Mao followed his teacher Yang Shangli to Beijing and through his intervention came into contact with Li Dazhao, a co-founder of the Chinese Communist Party. Mao experienced the May 4th movement and met his future second wife in Beijing. Nothing is known about stays abroad. Many Chinese communist leaders, however, had spent the early 1920s abroad. Contrary to official Chinese propaganda, Mao was not one of the participants in the founding of the Communist Party of China in Shanghai in 1920, but was only present at the first Party Congress a year later as one of the delegates. And he was allowed to sit on the Central Committee in 1923. The Communist Party had to go underground for a time, and Mao fled to the mountains with only 1,300 fighters, where he met other party comrades and their fighters. Already in this phase, Mao's purge operations against his opponents and parts of the local population began. Thanks to Soviet help and also the hesitancy of the nationalists, the Chinese communists were soon able to control an area with 500,000 people. In 1934, the communists had to undertake the infamous Long March to Yan'an in the north, with Mao being carried in a sedan chair. In Yan'an, people grew a lot of poppies in order to finance themselves by selling opium. The Chinese nationalists under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek were dependent on the Anglo-Americans and relied on them for essential supplies and military strategy. It was rumored that Chiang had more graduates of the elite American university Harvard in his cabinet than US President Roosevelt. For tactical reasons, Stalin recognized the Chinese nationalists and ordered Mao to stay put, expand his positions, and initially avoid major open confrontations with the nationalists. Stalin's idea at times was to be content with the northern part of China and leave the south to the nationalists and their American allies. US General Stilwell had the president's back and a high degree of control over the Chinese nationalist forces. The United States were unrivaled in terms of production and technology, and they were able to supply more than enough material. Mao received a lot of equipment from the Russians, although Russia was in financial trouble. Under these conditions, it should have been obvious that America and the Chinese nationalists would prevail, but in the end, the communists won. There was a heated debate in the United States about who was responsible for the misery. They said, "Who lost China?" And some pointed the finger at the highest levels of America. The politicians, of course, made stupid excuses. It was said that the United States had tried, with the best of intentions, to unite both sides in China. They were too hesitant, that the Chinese nationalists were too disorganized and corrupt, that some people may have believed Mao's propaganda, etc. The American five-star general George C. Marshall had essentially ordered Chiang Kai-shek to stop hunting and destroying the communists, at a time when the communists were weak and could have been defeated. Mao got a break, was able to reorganize his troops, find new recruits, and integrate hundreds of important Soviet advisors, many of whom probably also had espionage assignments. At the same time, the Americans made cuts under pretexts. Supplies were stopped to the Chinese nationalists and even caused a temporary embargo. The United States, ostensibly wanting to prevent hundreds of millions of people in China from falling under communist control, left the Chinese nationalists starving. The nationalists had to fight battles with huge losses and grapple with internal problems, such as mismanagement, lack of organization, and poor pay. The middle class of the population was taxed more and more, inflation and corruption were rampant, as a result of which the Americans withdrew more and more support. For a manageable amount of money, the Americans could have saved at least the south of China from the communists. For Europe after the Second World War, there was the Marshall Plan with large investments. There was also a lot of money for Greece and Turkey to contain communism. But when it came to China, the Americans suddenly became stingy. Rather, it appears that the United States and Soviet leaderships negotiated the matter at the highest levels. The Chinese communists made great progress with the tactic of besieging large cities and starving the populations within them. The communists eventually took the city of Beijing. Deng Xiaoping forcibly recruited millions of civilians for a variety of tasks, from soldiers to workers in the military supply chain. Chiang Kai-shek ultimately resigned. The Americans in his cabinet had abandoned him. US General Albert Wedemeyer, educated at West Point and Fort Leavenworth, considered a staunch anti-communist, became chief of staff under Louis Mountbatten in 1943, who was commanding the Allied forces in Southeast Asia and holding the title Supreme Allied Commander of the Southeast Asia Command. General Wedemeyer succeeded General Joseph Stilwell as chief of staff to Chiang Kai-shek and the commander of Southeast Asia forces in the Republic of China. Normally, there is an orderly handover of command with detailed instructions. But Stilwell had simply left, leaving Wedemeyer almost nothing. The staff shrugged their shoulders and said that Stilwell always kept everything important in his pocket. On December 7, 1945, Wedemeyer met with General Douglas MacArthur and Navy Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, and a plan was made to threaten the communists with moving many more nationalist troops north and even into Manchuria. This was intended to encourage the communists to seek a common solution with the nationalists. Stilwell advocated distributing Lend-Lease funds to the nationalists and communists so that the Japanese could be fought better. Chiang Kai-shek was horrified. 3 nationalist divisions equipped by the United States defected to the communists, without the espionage of the Americans and nationalists getting wind of it beforehand. One division consists of around 20,000 soldiers. US President Truman used this as an excuse to impose an arms embargo and stop supplying the Chinese nationalists. After the complete defeat of the nationalists, General Wedemeyer testified before the US Congress that the nationalists had lost mainly because of the lack of supplies from the US and because the Western mass media and politicians had no sympathy for the nationalists. The fighting morale of the nationalists had collapsed. Vice Admiral Oscar C. Badger, General Claire Chennault, and Brigadier General Francis Brink also said the arms embargo was a significant factor. Chinese government official Qin Tongliang wrote of General Joseph Stilwell, the principal US representative to China, "From the perspective of the fight against communism, Stilwell has done China a great disservice." Stilwell had simply carried out his orders from Washington by General George C. Marshall. In 1946, General Marshall used the tactic of withholding ammunition to secretly and quietly disarm Chinese forces. When we look at General Marshall, we must remember that in the United States, the civilian wing has the final say in military matters. And that brings us to the then Secretary of War, Henry L. Stimson, Marshall's superior and a member of the Order of Skull and Bones. For a very long time, American security experts, especially intelligence professionals, have wondered What was the secret of the success of the communists? They never really invented any new trick or technique. It seems that the secret was that Britain was compromised, and thereby also these old intelligence networks in the United States.